How do you start a scene? Or where is the beginning? Writing killer scenes, becoming a scene expert in just one day. So how do you start a scene? For some writers, the hardest part of writing is staring at the blank page and not being able to figure out where to start. This is especially true somewhere around the middle of the book, and it feels murky and muddling and hard to start a new scene when you have to do it. Gabriel Garcia Marquez once said, "One of the most difficult things is the first paragraph. I have spent many months on a first paragraph, and once I get it, the rest comes out very easily. In the first paragraph, you solve most of the problems of your book. The theme is defined, the style, the tone." According to Raymond Obstfeld, the beginning of a scene has only one mission: hook the reader. It must make the reader want to keep reading. So the question becomes, how do you hook the reader? Obstfeld says to treat it like a blind date. Make it beautiful. Make a good first impression. Be interesting. So then you're asking, what's interesting? What's one way to make it interesting even? And there's a few. There's action openings. So action openings is like something's happening, and you want to make sure that this action shows plot conflict, show that the conflict's almost there, the tension. It needs to be an action that causes a reaction, show that something's happening that's going to make our protagonist react. And then there's dialogue as action openings. And there are a ton of people who think dialogue openings for scenes are really awful. And there are a ton of people who adore them and think they are the best way to open a scene ever. Dialogue is action. So it is the act of a person speaking, right? It makes the reader feel like they've fallen into a story, into a conversation, eavesdropping on the people in the world, but in the book's world. So since there's so many lovers and naysayers, you want to make sure that if you do this, you want to make it interesting. Because if you like it, you want to turn those haters around, right? So Raymond Obstfeld has a great example of an interesting dialogue opening from his own novel, because writers are narcissists and they like to use themselves as examples. But it's Earth Angel is his book. And here's the opening. "I read somewhere," Carol said, kneeling to wipe the blood from the floor, "that a couple of years ago they had an auction in Paris where a guy bought Napoleon's penis." So this is interesting because, one, she's wiping blood off the floor and we're wondering, why is there blood on the floor? Two, he used the word penis, which is sort of a funny contradiction to the blood, but also not a word you're expecting in the first line of a book. Three, it's weird. It's Napoleon, it's an auction, it's a penis, there's blood, Carol's kneeling. It's just a little weird. So the worry is that sometimes these dialogue openings are flat or boring or create that talking head feeling because the writer has forgotten to include any setting or grounding elements. So in order to make sure that you do stay interesting and it's not talking headsy, you want to do things like kneeling to wipe the blood off the floor. We now know that Carol is somewhere where there's a floor, where there's blood, and she's kneeling. We have a insight, a grounding of Carol in that scene, which we may not have if all of this right here was just gone. Jump cut openings. This is like in the movies where one scene goes to black and then you have a completely different scene that doesn't have a link back to that previous scene or chapter. The relationship between the scene that just ended and the scene that just started is not obvious. Those are totally a tactic you can use. The promise opening. This is the opening line that tells you that something big is going to happen. It's something like, "On the morning of the very last day of her 13th year, Bunny McHopper had no idea that her life was about to change dramatically. Nobody ever does." The reader knows that melodrama and interest will begin because, something's going to happen. We learned it right there. Then there's the mystery opening. You set up a mystery in that first line and that reader really wants to know about, hopefully. We all like to solve things, to understand, and we'll get to read. We'll read and read to get those answers. My first book started that way. He wants to know why it happens. know why what happens. There's two mysteries there. And now that I think about it, that was kind of mean of me. Sorry, readers. So then there's the actual beginning as opening. This should usually be the beginning of the story and not the character's actual birth or the Big Bang or whatever. But you can always make a case for that depending on your story. But starting at the beginning often means starting with setting and description, or for far too many of us writers, waking up in bed to face a brand new day or to shake off a nightmare. Also, this is usually a chapter beginning and not a scene beginning. And then a way to begin is just describing who your character is. This tends to start a book or a point of view scene. It's where either the main character describes herself in the first person point of view, or someone else describes her, not first person point of view. So in first person, it would be, I'm Carrie, the neurotic writer, and I have the fact that I'm neurotic, or that I'm so neurotic that I have to freaking announce it to the whole world. Nobody gets me. Or in the third person point of view, when she was young, Carrie's mother told her she could not be an artist. So there's examples. Then there's the dream opening. This is considered a cliche. If the dreams are an important part of your character's psychic development or a part of the plot, it can work. But the problem is that readers get enraptured by the brilliance of the dream, and then poof, it turns out that it's not totally real. Yes, an entire book is not real usually, but this is one more level of trickery, and people can be a little annoyed and put off by it. But like all the rules, this can happen and work, especially if the narrative voice announces that it's a dream right near the beginning of the dream sequence. So here's a little bit more advice. Raymond Obstfeld writes, "The secret of a good opening is that it must compel the writer as much as the reader. To do this, you should think of the opening lines as a separate entity from the scene itself." Thanks for listening to this session, module, whatever you want to call it. We'll write better now and making killer scenes. I hope you stick around. Well, let's go learn some more.